Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the question of polygamy in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Polygamy, first of all, that's by definition, that's when you have one spouse marrying not a different spouse, but several spouses. So one person marrying several other people. And this is not something that is expressly forbidden in the Bible. There's no passage in the Bible that says you shall not have more than one wife, or I guess you could go the other way, and you shall not have more than one husband. Although in Jewish culture, there's no record of that ever taking place. There were situations in other parts of the world. The Spartans had practiced a form of polygamy. It wasn't quite that way, but it was close enough where it would come under that heading. And yet I would say that it's not in accordance with the creation design. God didn't create Adam and Eve and Hilda. He created Adam and Eve, a man, a woman, and that was the design that we see in the Garden of Eden. But we see early on that it was permitted in the Old Testament. We have the story of Lamech. It's only mentioned in brief and in a sort of a poetic sort of thing in Genesis chapter 4, where he has two wives. Now, it doesn't say, and that was good. In fact, in the context, it seems to have not been a good thing in conjunction with some other not good things that Lamech did. But later on, we have the examples of Jacob, who marries both Leah and Rachel. We have others in the Old Testament that had wives. Now, it's interesting to note that in the law, kings were told, don't multiply wives. And yet we see people like David and Solomon who did that, I think in certain cases to their detriment. But it was permitted in the Old Testament. And yet, even when you see it in the Old Testament, there were issues that are seen in the practice. For example, the tendency to show partiality to one wife over the other. 1 Samuel chapter 1 is the story of Hannah, who is in a polygamous marriage. She and another wife are married to the same man, and there's some jealousy and some partiality, and it's not a good situation. Jacob and his family are a very dysfunctional family. I mean, we have people that are brothers that are half brothers trying to put each other to death, and that's a bad thing. So jealousy among the wives, that's the Jacob story. Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1 actually mentions that as being an issue, and that led to all sorts of other problems, rivalry and hatred among the children, again in the Jacob story and then in the Jacob narrative, where there were those sons that had been brought about by one wife, and they were over against the son that had been brought by another wife, and that wasn't pretty. If anything, that's designed to tell us don't go and do that. We also read in the New Testament. Now, by the time the New Testament comes about, polygamy was not regularly practiced by either the Jews or the Greeks or the Romans by this time. There were other cultures out there that did practice polygamy, but not the mainline cultures. And so we read in both Timothy and Titus that leaders in the church are called to be the husband of one wife, like the way the Greek says that, a one-woman man. And I think that speaks about more than just the issue of polygamy, because that wasn't really a pressing issue by this time. I think it's also talking about marriage and divorce and a husband that's faithful to a wife and hasn't had, I think, sometimes what we call serial polygamy, where you're married and then you divorce, you marry somebody else and you divorce. No, leaders are not called to do that, or but also notice not called to have more than one wife. Now, finally, and I know this is going to be a short segment, I want to talk about Jesus. Because there the picture is, remember, he has the bride. And the idea of the bride is an Old Testament idea before it becomes a New Testament idea, where God said Israel is his bride. And Jesus talks about the church being his bride. And that doesn't mean that Jesus has two wives, the Old Testament wife and the New Testament wife. No, he's made the two into one. We have, Israel, and I guess we could say New Testament Israel, i.e. the church. It's one people, Jew and Gentile, and he does not have two brides. So I would say Jesus is not polygamous. I know that there's some theological, underpinnings that I'm stepping on there. But no, he does not have two wives. He has one bride, and he has made the two into one. Both Old Testament and New Testament, and they've come together, the Old Testament believers and the New Testament believers, into one body of Christ.